welcome back to the Land and Climate podcast. My name's Bertie Harrison-Brudzinski, and today I'm talking to American science journalist Stephen Robert Miller about his new book, Over the Seawall, Tsunamis, Cyclones, Drought, and the Delusion of Controlling Nature, combining reporting from central Arizona, southwestern Bangladesh, and northeastern Japan. It's a study of maladaptation and all of the risks and complexities that arise from efforts to protect ourselves from changing weather and climate.
As soon as something becomes profitable, it runs the risk of being co-opted by people who are into it more for the profit than for the need or the actual role of this project, like a seawall or an embankment or whatever. The fundamental argument that I try to make in this book is that we cannot adapt to climate change with the same mentality that we use to cause it.
I began by asking Stephen what had led him to write the book.
Yeah, so I'm an environmental journalist based in the American West, and for many years now I've been charting stories about conservation and water issues, and climate change has come up repeatedly over the years, and more lately, obviously, especially in some of the intermountain states like Idaho and Montana, Wyoming and Colorado. I kept coming across these stories of people who had remade the natural world to gain something, to help them in their own needs. And oftentimes these were ranchers who would straighten out streams. The idea was to straighten a stream out so you could get the water from where it was coming off the mountains to your fields or to your cattle more quickly and more directly. Humans have this thing about straight lines, where we like straight lines. And of course, the natural world does not really operate in straight lines that often. Well, the stories that I was writing were about these the ranchers who straightened these streams out and then found that fish in these streams were dying. And these fish would be oftentimes a huge economic boon or a sustenance boon for the native people downstream and other communities along further downstream of these cattle ranches and farms. And so the issue was that by straightening the streams out, they were actually causing the water to warm up in the streams, because natural meandering streams, the water goes slower, it eddies, it creates these deeper pools where things can get cooler. And a lot of the fish like steelhead trout and things depend on this cold water. And so the stories were about people who had made these changes. They'd altered their natural world, and now they were realizing that they had to go back and undo their previous changes because they had screwed something up. And that would be bad enough. Then you factor in the impacts of climate change and just that the world around them was getting warmer also. And so suddenly their little attempt to bring water more quickly to their fields became a huge fiasco in a way that really had downstream impacts. It was really the downstream impacts that I found most interesting, that somebody upstream could make a decision like this that seemed kind of small and insignificant at the time, but it could devastate communities downstream that were depending on fish that were no longer there because they couldn't survive the warm water. And so that got me into this idea of backfiring adaptations.
I approached this book having written some articles and interviewed other people about having too much hope or faith in new technological solutions for climate change and modeling that ends up being misleading and that kind of thing. I thought it would very much just be that kind of conversation. But what kind of surprised me reading it is I left it feeling like the book had more questioned the idea of what adaptation actually should be and what it means. And this buzzword that we hear a lot in the climate sector maybe hasn't really been clarified or defined that well. The quote that really stuck with me from this was this Bangladeshi academic that you quote, who's called Dilip Datta at Khulna University, asking who we're doing adaptation for, because he suggests that short-term adaptations for current living generations would harm people further down the line, and vice versa. If we were going to do long-term adaptations, there will be a kind of short-term cost to that. So I was interested to know whether you approached this project with a specific idea of what adaptation means, and whether that changed throughout the research that you did, and what the contentions or contradictions are with the phrase adaptation that policymakers might need to think about.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a fascinating topic. And I think you're dead on that adaptation is kind of new in a sense, at least in terms of the way we think about it in relation to climate change. For so many years, it was almost kind of a bad word to use because there was a sense that by prioritizing and funding adaptation, we would be detracting and taking funding away from mitigation. And so people were like, let's not talk about adaptation because, right now our focus needs to be just drawing down greenhouse gases. To the people in the adaptation world also fully understand that. But the reality is now that we could keep crossing these thresholds and we keep having these COP meetings that don't really amount to much of anything substantive. And the reality is that we are feeling the impacts of climate change all over the world, and we need to do something to protect ourselves from them. So adaptation, whether we like to think about it or not, is a necessity. So then it's like, well, we should do it right. And what does it mean? So when Professor Datta gave me that quote, said that to me, it was the first time I had visited Bangladesh. And at that time, I was not working on this book. At least I didn't think I was. I was visiting there because I was traveling with a researcher by the name of Amanda Carrico out of the University of Colorado. And her focus is on environmental ethics. She was looking at common pool resource issues in Bangladeshi villages and also migration in Bangladesh. And I was just interested in some of the things that she was working on. So I traveled along with her to Bangladesh one time, and we ended up having a conversation with Datta, and he made that quote about who are we adapting for? He asked that question in our conversation, and I immediately wrote it down. And honestly, that particular question is one of those things that you have, notebooks of your work, your research. That question is carried on over and over and over again. All of my different notebooks and all the margins, I keep penciling that question, who are we adapting for? For me, that is probably the guiding light in this book for my research, the way I kept orienting myself around this problem. Because that is so crucial. I think near-term adaptation done for us in the immediate time it often falls into, it can be corrupted by greed and political envy and ambition. It can be confused by our kind of arrogance and our overindulgence and belief in our technology. Because when you're thinking short-term, you can build an enormous dam or cut a canal or something and see it work for a few years and just marvel at that the thing even exists because it's such a feat of engineering. And it's easy to step back from that and say, nice, we did it. We adapted. But that's not what adaptation is. I came to learn in the process of writing this book that adaptation is not an event. It's not a thing. It's not a solution. It's a practice that you have to continuously engage with over time. The buzzword resilience, which I think has been thrown around so haphazardly that it almost lacks any real value anymore. But it's about being able to weather shocks and be malleable. And that's what I think real adaptation is this ability to react so that when things change down the road, you're not locked into doing something one way. And that matters for the people who come after us. Like I said, like with the stream meandering thing, now people are spending all this money and effort to make straight streams turn again. Something that's, these streams spent thousands or millions of years doing. Now humans are trying to redo that because we screwed it up one time because we thought we would straighten it out for our own immediate benefits. And so, adaptation becomes the question of who we are adapting for should, I think, guide all of our decisions when it comes to adaptation, because the impacts of the things that we build today are going to be felt for generations to come. They'll last a lot longer than just the generation that builds the thing.
There is quite a cynical side to what Professor Datta is saying there, right, as well, because he's kind of suggesting that you almost need a sacrificial generation while you're implementing these changes. I wondered whether you agreed with him on that aspect of it, because a lot of the short-term solutions that you analyze in this book, you say didn't really work anyway. Do you see it that kind of way, that we need to be quite stoic about putting long-term solutions in place that might not necessarily protect us in the short term? Or
Datta's perspective I found fascinating, brilliant, and also a bit terrifying, because he was in Khulna, which is down near the coast in southwest Bangladesh. So he was very much in the thick of it. He's not one of these academics, a world away, who's just dropping in, people like me, who just drop in for a short time and collect all the information they need to go write their article or their report. He was living it. But his perspective was, that he said at one point to me that the nature will always win. People will try to fight back against her, but in the end, she will always prevail because she's thinking long-term. She's thinking generations in the future. He referred to some of the previous Sidr and Isla and some of the previous cyclones that have hit Bangladesh and how they really just destroyed parts of the coast and damaged people's livelihoods and killed people. He said this in a kind of an offhanded way, so I, take it with a grain of salt, but his comment was about how those cyclones were doing what needed to be done, because people had not really been living in that part of Bangladesh until the land had been kind of remade for it. That land had largely been forested, mangrove forest, and all down to the coastline. And years of agriculture under kind of like the colonial yoke had prioritized clear-cut a lot of the Bangladeshi floodplain and to make it into agriculture and to support communities and villages and cities and things. And so his argument was kind of that this land should not be inhabited. It's not safe for people to live there. And the cyclones are kind of pushing people back. And that's what needs to happen, because if we keep trying to make it livable, if we keep putting people there, we keep building these embankments and these fortifications to make life tenable in this area, we're only putting people in harm's way. But to say that like these cyclones were doing what needed to be done, Those are not his exact words, but it was close. To me, it was like, wow, that's quite the comment to make when you're living in a place where people are dying regularly as a result of climate change and cyclones, storm surges, and all this, and floods. But I think he's also at a place in his career, where he's been around the block, and part of me almost felt like he was willing to speak his mind because he didn't really think anybody was listening. Because in Bangladesh, it kind of feels that way. The government is notoriously corrupt. No matter how long people have been saying the same things about the embankments being problematic and maladaptive in this region, the government continues to build more and more walls and higher walls. There's very limited protections for the environment. And I think Datta just was kind of maybe exasperated with all that and just thinking, at this point, no one's even listening anymore,
You write your book in kind of 3 sections. The first being about East Coast Japan and seawalls. The second being about Bangladesh and polder canal systems are designed to protect from flooding. And you also talk about how agriculture there has shifted towards shrimp farming as the water has become salinated. And then the third section of the book is about colonial water management in Arizona, really, and how that's led to more, I guess, unsustainable forms of farming and has dried up the desert. I was interested to ask you why you chose those 3 case studies and whether each of them represented or symbolized something to you. And also why all 3 are kind of about water management and water, and whether human adaptation to climate always comes back to water management, in your opinion.
You're absolutely right. They all are one way or another about water. And there are plenty of other things to look at with climate adaptation. But water is our most basic need. And without it, you don't even get food. I think that's the way that most people are experiencing climate change. It's going to be heat and water, right? And the heat thing is not always, but we talk about drought, obviously, is just the lack of water. And so a significant chunk of climate adaptation is managing water, either having too little or too much of the thing. That's what so many of these adaptations that we're currently building are. I think most of the money seems to be going into those types of projects, whether it's building a seawall or a desalination plant or cloud seeding, something like that. It's often about managing water. Not that there's other things to do, but that's definitely a focus we have. It's a water-based world. I chose those 3 case studies because they all represent something specific to this bigger issue, some I think, a really important part of the story. The story in Bangladesh with the embankments in the Ganges Delta, that was the first one that I really recognized as maladaptation. And it was after that first visit that I made to Bangladesh that I saw that happening. And it started to make sense to me, like, oh, this is what maladaptation is. And in Bangladesh, it's happening on this huge scale, both geographically spread out across the entire country, even though it's a small country, and also temporally, because this is something that started centuries ago, really. I mean, in the book, I talk a lot about the early colonists in the company and how they really kind of set the tone for the modern adaptations that we have today. I came across the Japan story in research, and for me, it was like the story in a nutshell. Whereas Bangladesh is this large, kind of slow onset thing that's creeping and over a big space. Japan happened immediately over a small area, relatively small area. That was the moment where I recognized maladaptation kind of in its most brutal and obvious form. And it helped to solidify the idea. It helped to make this whole kind of wonky academic concept much more relatable and manageable for me. And so I realized that, like, okay, this is a story in a nutshell. I'm going to lead with this in the book because it was the moment where I really had that light bulb flicker on and understood what maladaptation was. And so I wanted the reader to kind of follow me through that process. So I lead off with a Japanese example. And then the Arizona example is, that's what I grew up in. I grew up in Tucson, Arizona, and studied journalism at the University of Arizona. And I grew up with this happening all around me. And I guess I had always had this kind of sense, even as a kid, that something is off here. Like there's so many people moving to this place. It's ridiculously hot. There's always talk in the newspapers, at least, about the lack of water and forthcoming water shortages. And one of my first jobs as a reporter was working for the climate assessment of the Southwest, where I was essentially translating academic work on climate into, layman speak for a website. So I was talking directly with climate researchers and just writing about what they were finding. It's more common to hear this now, but this was years ago. And these researchers were terrified about their findings, and nobody seemed to really be paying attention. And so in the back of my mind, Arizona was always going to be a story. And to me, it was understanding maladaptation that helped me understand why I was so perplexed by what was going on in the desert, in the place where I grew up, because it explained what was wrong there. That these people, myself included, my family, we had all kind of been led into harm's way, I think, by the construction of these massive infrastructure projects, namely the Central Arizona Project Canal. Not to say that these projects haven't facilitated lives and brought in tons of money for the economy and done a lot of great things. But the reality is they've also brought in, millions of people to an area where life is not particularly easy to sustain. And sustaining it, we have now realized, puts a huge stress and tax on a larger system. When it came to understand maladaptation in Japan and then Bangladesh, I applied those lessons to Arizona, came home and saw it for the first time, as the poem goes.
You were talking about how the Japanese case study kind of feels like what you're talking about really boiled down into the perfect example in many ways. And it's deeply, deeply tragic what you're writing about, but does have moments that almost seem like these very dark satires as well. Like you start with this scene of people on the Seawall in 2011 before this huge tidal wave, watching it come towards them, feeling safe that they're going to be protected because they've been told that they will be. I thought that was interesting as well because it seems quite different to the kind of desperate hopefulness that we hear a lot of with technological solutions where people are kind of just hoping that CCS or something like that might protect them, and more like a kind of blind faith in what they've been told. And also that it runs counter to a lot of the narratives that we hear now in the press about how people don't trust institutions anymore and they don't trust experts. So I wondered what your thoughts were about how people who aren't experts are meant to navigate the sea of information that we're now in, how people can know when they're safe and when they can't, and what they should be doing.
That's one of the reasons why I also wanted to include the Japanese example, is because, it's a obviously highly developed country that has all the modern amenities and more than you would find in the US, and yet people there still succumb to this thing. There are a lot of examples of maladaptation happening in developing parts of the world. I'm an American and think a lot of my readers will be Americans, and just thinking about the American mentality, it's kind of easy to look outside. It's common for Americans to look out and be like, well, that's happening to them, but it won't happen to me. Those people don't look like me. They don't talk like me. That won't happen here at home. And I think Japan obviously is very different from the US, but in a lot of ways is very similar. And I wanted Americans to look out there and say, wow, if it's happening to them, maybe it actually can happen here. But then it's different at the same time, because maybe this is a bit of a caricature, but the fundamental difference between the Japanese and American mentality, or maybe personality, is this kind of trust in the government and technology and expert advice. And in Japan, I encountered this, as much as it is a stereotype, I did encounter it quite often. And it was a reason why a lot of people died during the 2011 tsunamis, because they had put their faith in their government and in their government's experts to solve this problem. And they really believed wholeheartedly that it had been handled. In the US, it's more of this every man for himself mentality. Americans seem to think that they will somehow outlast all these problems just on sheer grit and tenacity and arrogance alone. In both cases, I think to your question about, how can individual people react to this? How do they navigate all this information? That's kind of where the Bangladeshi example for me really came in, because that was a place where you had outside investment and support and all these experts from Japan and the US and the Netherlands and England and everywhere coming in and telling the Bangladeshi people how to manage their water. And all of these answers, not all of them, but many of these answers end up being incredibly problematic, maladaptive, and in some cases just downright destructive. I think it's been a growing movement for decades, but people are coming, you even see aid organizations now being all about local governance, and bottom-up solutions is suddenly a thing we're talking about. Whereas it used to be, well, we know how to farm, so we're just going to show you how to farm. Now it's like, we're here to support bottom-up solutions. One of the actual solutions that I talk about in the Bangladeshi section of tidal river management is something that really grew up from local communities as a response and a rejection of the government's hand in all this. And so I guess adaptation is specific to the space and the people. It's about more than just the technology and the immediate geography or coastline or whatever. It's also about the culture and the norms in this place and the way people react to things. And so it has to have local buy-in. And I think it will not be successful if it's imposed from outside. It has to be something that the people themselves come up with. And so in Japan, that means local people need to be willing to speak up and trust themselves and not just take what their government tells them as what should be done. And the government needs to listen to the people and give them agency. In the US, Americans also need to take that, to consider the information around them and also recognize their role in all of this. If you want to be an individualist, you've also got to recognize not just your supposed ability to protect yourself, but also your responsibility toward the problem as a whole and the way you live. And so those solutions have to come from individuals and from communities first, I think, before they get to the larger level.
You were just saying there about some of the cultural issues, and that was also something that really came through when I was reading your book, how socio-cultural factors can massively determine the success or failure of some of these things. Like in Japan and Bangladesh, you talk about examples where people moved to areas with adaptation or didn't leave them when crisis hit. And then there were more deaths as a result in the more protected areas. But you also talk about cases in Japan where seawalls had meant that fishing was no longer tenable, or tourism was no longer tenable, or it just wasn't a nice place to live anymore because you couldn't see the ocean. I guess this also just comes back to community engagement. But I was going to ask, do you think the kind of humanities academics and sociologists and things like that have been left out of some of this planning and some of these conversations too much?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, that's something that I learned in the process of reporting this. I definitely come from more of a background of the hard sciences, In the process of reporting this book, researching this book, I was really opened up to especially like political geography and environmental psychology and some of the more social science aspects of these universes. I started writing the book thinking about concrete and like rebar and computer programs and copper wire. And I intended to really just write about those things and have these deep, deep descriptions about these walls and all these, how this stuff was built. But as I worked through the book, I became much more interested in the people behind the things, their individual stories and the cultures and the human histories behind these massive structures. It came to realize how inseparable those two things are. The adaptation in both the physical form and its human form, I think these are two totally inseparable issues, and they have to work well together. In Japan, I kept talking to people who had attended some of these community meetings after the wave about how they were going to rebuild these communities, these cities along the coast. And initially what happened was these experts from the government came in, and they were seismologists and engineers and things. And they had these models to show how the land would be inundated by future tsunamis and how high they could build a wall and how that would stop, a certain height wall would stop the water from inundating this much land. And I think because people were so traumatized by what had just happened, their initial reaction seemed to be, yes, please build a big wall. We can't have this happen here again. And there's some politicians saying we will make the land impregnable to water, which is like pretty much impossible. As time went on, like weeks, months, and then eventually years in the reconstruction process after the tsunami, the local people started to recognize that maybe the wall wasn't really the best solution for them because of those things, because it was going to cut them off from the sea. It was going to ruin the view for the tourism industry. It would change the local ecology and migration of sediment and rivers and also marine life and things. And local people started to recognize that they wanted something different. In the book, I interview historians and folklorists, social scientists. Also, the Japanese government over time started to interview and talk to those people and bring those people more into the fold of discussions about what to do. So I do think they deserve a lot of credit for that. They recognized, the need for this other perspective in the expert world. One of the schools I spent a lot of time in the book in Tohoku University, I think one of the reasons I chose it was because it had experts from all over the fields. One of the people I spent a lot of time talking to and traveling in Japan with, Sebastian Boré, is a Frenchman who lives and works in Japan, has for years, but he studies death and burial rites and memorialization of the dead. And he, had been researching the ways that people are reacting to the loss of, 20,000 lives. He's part of this university. You definitely tell that there's been a more of an acceptance and a priority given to the social sciences as a reaction and a recognition of the fact that this is an important part of the adaptation puzzle.
Before we run out of time, I did want to ask you whether you could tell the story of Polder 22 and this local activist in Bangladesh, Karuna, and the contextual backdrop of shrimp farming, because it was just one of the bits of the book I found so interesting and a very engaging, emotional story as well.
The story of the shrimp farming thing, for me, it was an example of how bad adaptations, in this case, the embankments built to control the rivers in Bangladesh, can have these long-term social and environmental, complex social and environmental histories. In this case, Polder 22 is up inland a little bit, so they're not so worried about storm surges from the Bay of Bengal, but they are worried about flooding in the rivers and in monsoonal floods. And they are essentially an island surrounded by rivers. One of the effects of the polders being built is salinity inland, salinity in a lot of these fields. And so people who had depended on rice paddy were finding that their fields were becoming saline.
And just to clarify, a polder is an area of island network of canals in a delta.
Yeah, so a polder is a Dutch idea that was imposed on Bengal. It's an island that was created by building up basically a ring of embankments or levees to hold rivers in place. And what you end up with then is rivers on the outside, walls on the banks of the rivers, and then the land on the other side of those walls, right, protected hypothetically from the rivers. In Polder 22, the issue was the rise and the interest in shrimp farming. As the impact of the embankments and salinity started to really cause problems, we had to come up with a solution to that problem. The first solution is the polders to deal with the flooding. The second, then that creates its own problems, and the solution to that then is shrimp farming. The idea was, this is an outside idea, like a foreign interest idea, was that if the land was too salty to be farmed for rice, well, we could just raise shrimp in the brackish water and take advantage of that brackish water. Hypothetically, this seems like a great idea. We're taking advantage of what's out there. We're creating a new economic possibility for these people, without having to force them to all move to the city or something. But as so often happens in these situations, the shrimp industry really gets co-opted by wealthy interest groups, wealthy, especially landowners. And in Polder 22, there was one landowner in particular who really wanted to take over a big chunk of the polder, to occupy that land and use it for his shrimp growing. This is something that's actually pretty common there, and it still is today. This happened back in the 90s. But he started sending the strongmen, essentially, somebody put it to me as like the shrimp mafia. But he started sending a strongman to go ask for these people to leave their rice paddies, move, so this guy can grow his shrimp. One of his plans is to break the embankment that holds back the rivers and to let the salt water from the tidal rivers to spill into the polder rather, flood the land so that he can use it to grow shrimp. Right, so it's kind of the opposite problem. In this case, he wants to actually break the embankment. Well, the local people who were raising rice here were dependent on that embankment because they needed it to keep the land dry so they continue to raise rice. They were trying to stop this embankment from being broken. And eventually it turned into a violent uprising where these strongmen came one day to push these people off the land, to wrest the paddy to their own needs, to break the embankment, flood it with salt water, and put in their shrimp. The local peasants fought back. And one woman in particular, Karuna Mari Sardar, led this resistance. The two groups, a group of strongmen, the group of peasants, met on an embankment road right next to the river one morning. And what started off as just a lot of like fist pumping and yelling and everything ended up turning pretty violent. And the strongmen had weapons, and I was told they had rifles and they had, kind of homemade bombs and things. Karuna was hit by a bomb and killed. Her body was immediately snatched up by the strongmen, and they assumed it was dumped in the river. The crowd of peasants fled after that happened, and so did the strongmen. They all turned around, jumped in their boats, and got out of there as fast as they could. The police never did anything about it, and the families never got the body back. But the strongmen gave up, this landowner gave up, and they did not break the embankment, and they did not seize the land and turn it into shrimp culture. Instead, it remained as rice paddy. I include that story in the book largely because it just shows how complex the tales of these bad adaptations can get. Other stories talk about peasants trying to break the embankments on purpose because they were so problematic. But in this case, they were trying to keep the embankment. These things are not just physical infrastructure on the land. They have cultural and human impacts. And these can get really complex very quickly. And so that was, in Polder 22 as an example of how that happened.
Yeah, one of the things I found interesting about that anecdote is that if we think of the shrimp farming as the adaptation rather than the embankment, once that adaptation became profitable, it actually incentivized bad actors to increase the original problem and make the water more salty.
That's exactly what, and it's still happening in Bangladesh. I wrote about this for The Guardian not that long ago. It still is kind of thought of as an adaptation to sea level rise and salinity encroachment, just raise shrimp. But the reality is when you raise, the shrimp production requires a ton of fertilizers, other chemical additives. It takes over land. It's been shown to cause underground drinking water to become salty, which is kind of crazy. But in Bangladesh, a land that's really defined by water, there's a lot of people there who don't have clean water to drink. And the shrimp industry is not helping that. And maybe if it were run by communities who also had to live in that area where they could see the impacts happening and they could adjust their methods so that they were maintaining their water supply and all that, maybe in that case, it could be done well. But so often, because there's so much money to be made in shrimp that gets exported largely to Western markets, The industry has been co-opted by wealthy elites who don't even live in these communities. They live back in Dhaka or something. They're not so concerned or even aware maybe of some of the negative side effects of this supposed adaptation. And so it's been incredibly problematic.
Do you think that issue of if you can make a new form of adaptation agriculture or another industry that's based on adaptation profitable, then wealthy interests are going to want to increase the need for that adaptation? Do you think that's a real risk in other scenarios, or is that quite a kind of unusual anecdote?
That is the fundamental risk, I think, in adaptation, is the profitability of it. That is something that we need to keep a really close eye on. I mean, in Japan, there wasn't agriculture, right? The seawalls aren't necessarily an agricultural product that was being sold, but just the construction of the seawalls, the concrete needed to build them, and the jobs that would be created by building these walls in a part in Tohoku, a northeastern region of the country that has been depressed for a long time and has been losing population faster than other parts of the country, has been aging out more quickly. There's a profit to be made. There's money to be made on the adaptation itself. I mean, it's the same in Arizona, the money to be made on building a desalination plant or building a pipeline. I mean, this is a real issue. As soon as something becomes profitable, it runs the risk of being co-opted by people who are into it more for the profit than for the need or the actual role of this project, like a seawall or an embankment or whatever. The fundamental argument that I try to make in this book is that we cannot adapt to climate change with the same mentality that we use to cause it. And in that case, I'm largely talking about global resource extractive capitalism. If we look at the ways that we can make adaptation profitable as a way to kind of spur investment in adaptation, we're going to run into all the same problems that we have already been trying to push our ways out of. And it's going to be just hugely problematic on its own.
Yeah, the seawall example is interesting, actually, because I would have presumed that seawalls are designed to last for a very long time without needing to be rebuilt, and a pretty large sector has developed around this industry now. Could there be any kind of planned obsolescence issue brewing where the industry will reach a point where making a perfect product would render itself obsolete?
I don't have the facts to back up the planned obsolescence part, but I mean, we'll say like concrete has a lifespan of about 50 years when it's exposed to seawater in most cases. And so the people building it know that, it's going to have to be rebuilt at some point in the not too distant future. In one case, I do think when it comes to a seawall especially, there's this never-ending cycle of rehabilitation. It's going to be a constant thing that we do. And for all the busy beaver engineers among us, that's a great opportunity because it means every single year, whether in Miami or New York or Japan or on the Thames or whatever, you're going to have people who are constantly employed making this wall a little bit higher, making it a little bit stronger. Is that necessarily a bad thing? Maybe not. But if you get to the point where you think about the way those walls deflect pressures from the waves, where they affect beaches and change beach erosion and movement, and the way that they lure people in with a false sense of security to living in places where they're bound at one point or another to get swamped. Then you start to wonder, there's a whole system behind these walls. It's not just the feature itself. And who is it intended to protect, right? This goes back to that question we started with data. Who are we adapting for? Is it just this person who lives behind this wall now? Or is it the people who are going to have to pay the taxes to fund this maintenance on this project for generations to come, only to find out that, this wall isn't even tall enough to protect us from the next wave or the next storm. And, by the way, we also don't have a beach anymore because it got eroded away because of this wall. And suddenly that question of who are we adapting for becomes, I think, the fundamental question in adaptation.
My thanks to Stephen Robert Miller for coming on the show, and to Vasco Kostovsky for our audio production. There should be a link to buy Over the Seawall in the podcast blurb, along with other links to further reading. If you enjoyed this episode, do follow, subscribe, or leave a review on your chosen podcast platform, and remember to visit www.landclimate.org for more content from us at the Land and Climate Review. We'll be back in 2 weeks with another episode, so goodbye until then, and thanks for listening.